loopholes by which a woman can divorce an adulterous man if he abandons her for 2 years, and if he's extremely violent to her, and if he has sex with a relative of hers, and if he rapes someone else. And then let's throw in sodomy and bestiality, because it's unlikely that the average adulterous heterosexual man will want to have sex with an animal or another man. And so there had not been this discourse, this hysterical discourse of, corruption, vice, abomination, degradation around sodomy up until literally that bill was passed, and almost as a way to redirect the nation's attention away from this very successful scrutiny of heterosexual men's misdeeds. Suddenly there was what the historian Scott Long calls a moral panic around sodomites and sodomy, and this coinage of this, the tenor of aversion in homophobia that we inherit today. And then you see for the next 30 years, sentences growing and growing in extremity, consensual male couples being arrested, in couples being brought in. Sodomy is moved from the category of, minor offenses like sheep stealing and coin clipping to rape, arson, and murder. It's tried by a magistrate instead of by a jury of your peers, so you're much more likely to be sentenced by a stranger from another social class. And you get these mass arrests. And then you get elaborations on this in the 1870s, venereological exams.
Mass arrests and executions.
Exactly.
Let's deal with the arrests first. You mentioned that prosecutions for sodomy rise by 50% between 1858 and 1860. I mean, what's that in numerical terms? Because it's hard to read from a percentage.
That's a good question. I mean, I was looking specifically at the Old Bailey records, so it's just one court. And I was looking at regional crime tables in national newspapers. So I don't have a definitive answer, except that the number of prosecutions rose by that amount.
Who was executed?
Well, that's really an important question because, first of all, let me just note that the vast majority of the sentences were penal servitude for lifetimes, or 10 or 15 years, or transportation to penal servitude in Australia, because penal servitude was invented basically in 1857 as well in the law as an alternative to executions. Paradoxically, not having penal servitude saved a lot of lives because people really didn't want to sentence their neighbors to execution. That's Bill and his friend Joe. We know them. So before 1857, there were vanishingly few sentences. But after 1857, with the introduction of penal servitude and the crackdown on this quote-unquote vice, and the new kind of discourse that said that man's sex with that other man threatened my nuclear family, right, which is a completely new idea. You get sentences, as I mentioned, of penal servitude for 10 or 15 years. And I found several dozen executions, but that was, again, only looking at the Old Bailey records and the crime tables.
Several
regionally.
Dozen executions? Correct.
And this corrects a misapprehension that is in every website, that the last man was executed for sodomy in Britain in 1835.
I don't think you're right about this. One of the cases that you look at that's salient in your report is that of Thomas Silver. It says teenagers were now convicted more often. Indeed, that year, which is 1859, 14-year-old Thomas Silver was actually executed for committing sodomy. The boy was indicted for an unnatural offence, guilty, death recorded. This is the first time the phrase unnatural offence entered the Old Bailey records. Thomas Silver wasn't executed. Death recorded. I was really surprised by this, and I looked it up. Death recorded is what's in, I think, most of these cases that you've identified as executions. It doesn't mean that he was executed. It was a category that was created in 1823 that allowed judges to abstain from pronouncing a sentence of death on any capital convict whom they considered to be a fit subject for pardon. I don't think any of the executions you've identified here actually happened.
Well, that's a really important thing to investigate. What is your understanding of what death recorded means?
Death recorded, this is also from, I've just read you the definition of it there from the Old Bailey website. But I've got here a newspaper report about Thomas Silver, and also something from from the prison records that show the date of his discharge.
The prisoner was found guilty and sentence of death was recorded.
Yeah. But
the jury recommended the prisoner to mercy on account of his youth.
See, I think this is a kind of... When I found this, I didn't really know what to do with it, because I think it's quite a big problem with your argument. Also, it's the nature of the offence here. Thomas Silver committed an indecent assault on a 6-year-old boy, and he served 2.5 years for it in Portsmouth prison, which doesn't seem too excessive, really. And I wonder about all the others, because all the others that I followed up, I can't find any evidence that any of these relationships that you described were consensual. The other one you offer us, James Spencer, 60-year-old tutor. He was a teacher who committed what was described as felonious assaults on schoolboys. I mean, one of these cases you offer is a bestiality case, and not a buggery case. So, I think there's a problem here with this argument.
I mean, I certainly will ask for the sources that you have. I mean, I was going by the Old Bailey records and regional crime tables, and if there's further details to be added. Well,
that's how I got this through that same sort of through that same portal. I mean, the problem is that the Old Bailey records doesn't give you any detail at all, does it? It's just names and then the verdict. So there's you don't get any sense, or there's nothing that I have seen that shows you what these relationships were. And I wonder whether, as I said, I can't see any evidence that any of them were definitely consensual romantic relationships.
Well, there I do have to argue with you, and I'm happy to, because I included in this version of the book selective cases, and if additional details show that this kid was not actually executed, that death recorded
means the opposite.
So that's really important, and I need to investigate that and update the book accordingly. And thank you so much for calling that to my attention.
Thank you for being so gracious about it, because I wonder whether, in a way, you couldn't use it slightly to make a counter case to this, that sodomy was punishable by death from, I think, 1533, but the Victorians removed that capital punishment with this death recorded strategy, making it a lesser offence rather than a greater one.
Well, I do make that point that in 1857 penal servitude was introduced as a punishment to avoid having to sentence people to execution for sodomy. But my research categorically shows that the convictions did escalate in the percentages that I identified.
But do we really know what they were being convicted for, is my question. You can't really be certain about whether or not consensual relationships being prosecuted here, because the only ones that seem to have made an impact on the record are sexual assaults.
I don't agree with you in terms of all of the cases that I address in the thesis version of this. And I'd be very surprised if that's the case with the majority of the sentences as well, because you do see couples being brought in who are adult men consenting. And you also see a lot of entrapment. And as you go along in the later decades of the 19th century, municipal police are, they do have quotas to fill, and they are sent to basically entrap people, to solicit people in public restrooms, in parts of parks that used to be meeting places for gay men. And you do see over and over, and I talk about this in the book, so I would respectfully, certainly look at your evidence, but I would really challenge you. I would be astonished if the majority of these were violent assaults or molestations of minors. And in fact, that's not what the record shows. If you look at all the Old Bailey convictions, it shows adults, and it shows adults that were not accusing each other of violence. It shows adults who were either accused of sodomy with each other by the state, not by each other, right? Or it shows adults who were entrapped, and it says the solicitation of buggery. Respectfully, when you say it's bestiality,
could that be consensual sex between men? The description bestiality.
Well, I was going to say, indeed, the word bestiality was sometimes used for consensual relationships between men, and often it's a little bit unclear in the Old Bailey records because it's B-Y. And so it could be bestiality or buggery.
This one is definitely bestiality, as it's in the register.
As I believe I say in the book, that is sometimes used as a term.
You about it forever, but unfortunately we have to bring this part of the programme to an end. Thank you both. Sarah's collection of essays on Michael Field will appear by Christmas, and Naomi Wolf's Outrages, Sex, Censorship and the Criminalization of Love is out now. And you'll find 19th century sexuality thrumming on our website and in the eminently downloadable Arts and Ideas podcast, which can offer you programmes on Walt Whitman, Oscar Wilde, Victorian bodies and Victorian beards.